Hi there, and welcome to a special edition of the Studyclix Podcast. We've teamed up with an expert teacher, Peter Tobin, to bring you a limited podcast series all about Othello, the play by William Shakespeare.
Peter has recorded a series of podcasts for us where he goes into the specific aspects of what you need to know about Othello when you're studying it for the Leaving Cert. He covers everything from characters and different themes in the play to understanding Shakespeare's writing techniques and tips on approaching exam questions.
This is the final episode in our podcast series all about Othello. Peter's going to talk you through the various different writing techniques Shakespeare uses to bring his story to life. First, you'll hear him talk about Shakespeare's use of soliloquies, and he'll wrap it up with a note on tragedy as a genre.
So, the next voice that you'll hear is Peter's. Enjoy listening.
In order to get the highest marks in your responses for the Leaving Cert, you need to be able to talk about Shakespeare's dramatic craft. And one of the most effective things that Shakespeare uses in creating a sense of drama in his plays is the soliloquy. On the most basic level, a soliloquy is when a character speaks to the audience, telling them of their inner thoughts, their hopes, their fears and their intentions. The difference between a dramatic monologue and a soliloquy is that a dramatic monologue is delivered to the other characters on the stage. A soliloquy, on the other hand, is only for the audience. Importantly, the other characters are unaware of what is being said in a soliloquy. While there are many soliloquies in the play, mostly for Iago and just 2 for Othello, there are a few in particular that are really important to note. In Act 1, Scene 3, Iago's first, he makes clear his feelings for Othello. He says, "I hate the Moor." We've seen Iago telling Rodrigo that he follows Othello for his own purpose. We've seen Iago supporting Othello, but here he makes his feelings clear. The beauty of the soliloquy is that, while in front of the other characters, Iago has reason to lie and be deceptive, when he speaks to the audience, he doesn't. There is a chance, of course, that he might be lying to himself, especially when he says that he hates Othello because there are rumours about him and Amelia. But even if he is lying to himself, he is showing his true self to the audience. In this soliloquy, in Act 2, Scene 3, Iago makes clear to the audience that he intends to use Desdemona's own nature against her. He will pour pestilence in Othello's ears so that with every word that Desdemona speaks in favour of Cassio, it will make her look guilty in Othello's eyes. Again, this soliloquy, for the dramatic irony in the sense of tension that builds from here right to the end. Every interaction between Othello and Desdemona after this point becomes really charged with tension and drama thanks to this soliloquy. In Othello's first soliloquy, in Act 3, Scene 3, we don't see a totally different side to him as we do with Iago. Instead, we see a more vulnerable side to him. In some ways, it's almost pathetic. He constantly repeats the word honest when talking about Iago, underlining the fact that he is completely unaware of what is happening. Also, in this soliloquy, he begins to link his problems with Desdemona to the fact that he is black. "For I am black, she is gone." Othello's language also becomes reflective of his state of mind. He says that he had rather be a toad than to keep Desdemona but for others to use for their pleasure. We could say that it is through the soliloquies that Shakespeare humanises the characters of Iago and Othello. Iago, confusion, bitterness and rage, very human emotions, come through strongly in his soliloquies, while Othello's isolation and vulnerability shine through in his. If you think about that for a second, you see that it's actually a really powerful dramatic tool. Shakespeare also makes use of lots of other dramatic techniques, such as dramatic irony, where the audience knows something that a character doesn't, but many dramatic techniques are dependent upon his use of soliloquy in the first place in order to create a connection with the audience.
That was all about Shakespeare and his use of soliloquies as a dramatic technique. Next up is a note on Shakespeare's use of setting in his writing.
The setting of any play is important, and even more so for Shakespeare because of the limits of the theatres in which his plays were first performed. Globe Theatre. Shakespeare didn't have the scenery or the props to transport the audience from London to Venice or Cyprus or any of the other places in which his plays are set. It's really important to pay attention to Shakespeare's use of setting because it often carries a lot of significance, and paying attention to his use of setting, especially in your answers when you're writing in your Leaving Cert exam, is what's going to get you the highest marks. The play starts in Venice. Venice in Shakespeare's time was a place of great wealth but also of great vice. It was the only place in Europe where prostitution was legal. It was also a trading post and maritime centre, and so a place where many cultures and peoples collided. Othello in Venice is tolerated. He is respected for his capabilities as a soldier, a general and a leader, but once he tries to cross those invisible boundaries of Venetian society and actually marry a white Venetian woman, we see the true colours of Venetian society come out. Brabantio values Othello as a military man, who keeps Venice safe but doesn't want him as a son-in-law. Venice, then, is a place of rules and conventions, many of them invisible. Othello, as an outsider, he breaks a number of these without knowing. He marries Desdemona in secret without asking permission. He promotes Cassio ahead of Iago. But the rules in Venice also protect Othello and Desdemona. There's really only so much damage that Iago can do while they are in Venice. Shakespeare's masterstroke, then, is moving the setting from Venice to Cyprus after the first act. Cyprus, over 2,500 kilometres away, is not governed by the same rules, and here Iago's plot flourishes and grows unchecked. In Venice, Othello is calm, cool and collected. In Cyprus, he is consumed by jealousy and suspicion. The journey to Cyprus itself is full of danger, and it's made clear in Act 2 that Cyprus is cut off from everywhere by the sea. Travelling back is dangerous and difficult. In this isolation, Iago is now free to do his worst. There's a suggestion towards the end of the play that what comes at the end could be avoided. Ludovico comes to Cyprus to call Othello home. There's a sense that despite the racism and anger in Venice, there they would be relatively safe from Iago's plotting and scheming. But with a great sense of drama, we don't get to find out if that's true because Iago, possibly sensing that if Othello leaves Cyprus he'll never get to see his plan out, he ramps things up so that none of them get to leave the island. What we see with Shakespeare's use of setting, then, is not so much description or detail, as he wouldn't have been able to represent those places accurately on the Elizabethan stage, but setting in a more symbolic way. When the setting changes, the action changes, and so we must pay attention to where the events are taking place to fully understand what the characters are going through.
Now you're going to hear Peter talk about how Shakespeare uses imagery and symbolism to effect in the play.
When analysing Shakespeare's use of language in Othello, it's important to note how he uses imagery and symbolism almost as shorthand for certain ideas that he wants to express. One of the first questions we might ask is why? Why is it necessary to use imagery and symbolism? Why not just tell a story? Well, Shakespeare understood that his main job was to entertain his audience, many of whom at the time were ill or uneducated, and so he creates images and pictures through the words he chooses in order to make the world of the play more accessible and more entertaining. There are many recurring images or ideas in Othello, including animal imagery, blood and violence, black and white, light and dark, the handkerchief and poison. And here we're going to look at two in particular in a bit more detail. The contrast between light and dark and black and white is established very early in the play, and the connotations are far-reaching. In Act 1, Scene 1, Rodrigo and Iago tell Brabantio that an old black ram is topping your white ewe, a reference to Othello and Desdemona consummating their marriage. While on the surface the white and black refer to their respective skin colours, the idea is established even earlier that light or white is about purity and truth, and dark or black is the opposite. Brabantio, a few lines before this, calls for light to figure out what's going on outside his home. Light brings truth and clarity, while dark brings confusion. The idea is echoed by the Duke shortly afterwards when he says, "If virtue no delighted beauty lack, your son-in-law is far more fair than black." Othello is so virtuous, so good, that he's much more white, fair, than he is black. The imagery of black and white is repeated by many of the characters, and even Emilia at the very end, shortly before her own death, says to Othello, "Oh, the more angel she and you the blacker devil." Again, the connotations, or the shorthand, is very obvious here. White or light is good, dark or black is bad. Another key image or symbol is the handkerchief. The main action of the play turns upon the handkerchief as proof of Desdemona's infidelity, so let's look at it a bit more closely in terms of what it symbolises. The handkerchief is white with red strawberries sewn into it. Othello tells Desdemona that it was made by a female prophet 200 years before, with the silk from sacred worms and the dye used for the red strawberries extracted from the hearts of mummified virgins. There's a lot to unpack here, but one of the simplest images is the idea of a red-stained piece of white cloth. There is a long tradition of inspecting or hanging out the bed sheets from the wedding bed of a newly married couple in order to show the bloodstains that are proof that the bride was a virgin when she married. This cloth in some ways represents this fidelity. Othello also tells Desdemona that his mother used the handkerchief to keep her own husband faithful to her, and so the fact that she loses it speaks volumes to Othello, and perhaps to the audience too, about what that might mean.
And finally, a note on tragedy as a play genre.
Othello is an example of a tragedy. Now, this doesn't simply mean that it has an unhappy or a tragic ending. It refers to a very specific genre or type of theatre that has certain conventions or rules that must be followed. Tragedy as a form of drama has a really long history, going all the way back to the 5th century BC in Greece, with plays by playwrights such as Sophocles and Euripides. But Othello is an example of a Shakespearean tragedy, and there are some general features that all of Shakespeare's tragedies share. In Shakespearean tragedy, the hero is always a man, and a man of status, an individual who is engaged in great events. Othello is the general of the Venetian forces, and he is a commanding presence. The tragic hero must be motivated by serious purpose or undertake a serious course of action. Now, Othello's serious purpose is that he intends to marry Desdemona, and then he intends to lead the Venetian forces against the Turkish and Cyprus. It is through this serious purpose or action that the tragic hero inevitably meets with serious physical and or mental suffering. The direction of his career in the play is always from a high position to a low one. Now, Othello starts off in a very high position, very high status, and by the end he's taken his own life, so he really has fallen from a great height. The hero's passage from good to bad fortune is the result of some initial and fundamental human error. Now, this is a really important one for Othello. So this may be a false step or a miscalculation or a defect of character. Such a defect is generally described as the hero's tragic flaw. Now, Othello appears too trusting or naive. Maybe this is his tragic flaw. He doesn't see deception and badness, malevolence in those close to him. External factors too have a part to play in Shakespearean tragedy, and it's very difficult to avoid the impression that fate is working against the hero from the beginning. For example, whatever Iago does, it works on Othello. Iago is very lucky at times, or we could say that fate is working against Othello. The audience must be persuaded to identify with the tragic hero and his sufferings. He must remind us strongly of our own humanity so that we can see him as in some way standing or representing us. He must be vulnerable to extreme suffering, as Othello clearly is, and we should feel some degree of pity and fear in response to what happens to him. For the hero, recognition is the essential tragic experience. It occurs when he finally understands his character and situation. However, it is through profound suffering that Othello achieves recognition, an understanding of the truth about himself and his relation to others. Suffering alone without recognition or self-knowledge is not fully tragic. And there's an important point here that makes Othello slightly different to Shakespeare's other tragic heroes, such as King Lear, Hamlet, and even Macbeth. None of those other heroes fall as far as Othello does, and Othello doesn't seem to reach the same level of self-recognition as those others do. At the end, Othello is still quite a pathetic character, while those other characters have restored some of their former glory. And this could potentially be because Othello's character isn't as fully explored as the others, he has much fewer soliloquies, or it could also be because he's a black character, a cultural outsider. Perhaps Shakespeare didn't truly intend him to be the central character of the play at all.
That wraps up this episode of the podcast, all about Shakespeare's writing techniques and use of language in creating Othello as a piece of theatre.
This is also the last episode in our podcast series on Othello. We hope that listening to these podcasts has helped you gain a better understanding of the play and has equipped you with the knowledge and skills to feel confident in approaching a Leaving Cert question on Othello.
Thank you for listening so far, and as always, if you want to get in touch to leave any feedback, questions or comments you might have for us, you can contact us by email at info@studyclix.ie. You can also chat to us directly on the Studyclix website via the chat box in the bottom right hand corner.
Yes, and as always, don't forget to subscribe to the Studyclix podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you can stay up to date with our latest episodes. If you want to support us, we'd love it if you could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or tell a friend about us so we can help as many students as possible.
And don't forget to follow Studyclix on social media if you're not already. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram and TikTok. We're always posting lots of fun stuff, lots of useful study tips and regular competitions, so it's well worth giving us a follow. This is the last episode in our Othello podcast series. Thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned to the Studyclix podcast to keep hearing more excellent advice on school and studying to help make your exams easier.